Hi. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about the concert experience since you will all be attending concerts for two of your class assignments. I'm sorry, I'm looking a bit bedraggled. It's been a long day. It's Martin Luther King Day. I hope it was a good one for all of you. You will be watching this for a week, but you will hopefully be watching this when we're usually meeting for class. And today I'm going to talk to you first about the concert experience. What to expect when you go to a classical concert, since most of you probably have never been to one before, and hopefully that it will be a good and interesting experience for you. So when you walk into the hall, make sure first thing you do is turn off your cell phones, because one of the most embarrassing things that could happen to you is your cell phone goes off in the middle of the concert, especially in a quiet place, and everybody in the hall is going to look at you. So turn it off, get into the moment, or the 30 minutes or whatever it is before intermission. And then when intermission comes, you can go outside and check your cell phone, check your messages, have a smoke, whatever you do. Okay, you've gone into the concert hall, and you're going to see a pianist or a singer who will generally be accompanied by a piano, or perhaps an instrumentalist. In this case, it's a flute with piano. Piano is the kind of default accompanying instrument for all kinds of reasons we will talk about. Or perhaps an ensemble, such as a piano trio, which we have in this. So we've not three pianos, but a piano, a violin, and a cello in this case. Could be any number of ensembles that would play. It could be a wind quintet, 5 people. And generally, when you go see the concert, whatever it is that opens a concert, if it's a recital such as this, it's going to be the same person or people throughout the recital. If you go to an orchestra concert, which I would highly encourage you to do if that works out in your schedule, you're going to see something like this, where there's going to be a conductor up front, and then there's going to be a huge battery of musicians. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the sections of the orchestra, because you need to know which are the major instruments and more or less where they are located. And it's going to be, for all intents and purposes, the same setup with every orchestra, with a couple of minor adjustments. So this is a map of the orchestra as you're looking from above. If you're sitting at the concert, you'd be out here somewhere. And you're going to be sitting in front of mostly strings. There are most of them because they are the softest instruments, and they don't project necessarily out towards you, depending on how they are held. So you will have 2 families of violins, the first and second violins. And over here, generally, you will have the violas, which is a little bit larger than the violin and a little bit deeper in sound. Then you'll have the cellos here, deeper yet. And then back here, where there is no actually string section, but maybe along this line, would be the double basses or the contrabasses that you generally either stand up to play, or they sit on stools sometimes. Okay, so that makes up the string family. Behind that are the woodwinds, which are reed instruments, except for the flute, which is basically, as a whole, you blow over, like if you're blowing into a Coke bottle or blowing over the top of a Coke bottle. But the flute is still considered a member of the woodwind family. And behind them come the brass, trumpets, French horns, trombones, tuba, if there's a tuba. And behind all of that, the percussion, which are the loudest. And over here would be the timpani, the kettle drums. In this picture, they are over here, and that happens too sometimes. It basically just depends on the conductor, how they want things set up. But largely, this is what you're going to expect to see. So first and second violins, this side, violas, cellos, basses back here. Then you've got your woodwinds, clarinets, bassoons in front of them, piccolos, which is a high flute, very high, flutes, oboes, again, and clarinets. Looks a little bit like a clarinet, but and you blow into it, but you blow into what's called a double reed, and we're going to watch a movie in just a moment. Behind them, the brass instruments, in this case, French horns. And in this diagram, they've got the trumpets and the trombones behind them. Frequently, depends on the orchestra, they could all be lined up in kind of a semicircle. Tubas, and then the other percussion instruments here. Here is a video which might help explain some of this.
The orchestra. It's just a group of musicians getting together to make music. How do they make these instruments work? Which instruments are related and why? To start, we can break the instruments into 4 families. Each family is grouped by the way the instrument produces vibration. This kind of classification gives us the string family, the woodwind family, the brass family, and the percussion family. When you think of the orchestra, you most likely think of the violin, or at least some sort of string instrument. This is probably because they make up the majority of the instruments in the orchestra, so good thinking. All string instruments use string vibration to produce sound, so it makes sense that they are called the string family. There are 4 main string instruments. These are the violin, the viola, the cello, and the bass. Each of these instruments can be plucked or bowed. As you can see here, the main difference between the 4 instruments is their size. As with any instrument, the smaller it is, the higher pitches it plays. And the larger the instrument is, the lower pitches it plays. A very common arrangement would have the violins playing the melody, and the violas, cellos, and basses playing supporting roles. This is not always the case, but it's important to know. These instruments are some of the oldest instruments made for the modern orchestra, and some early orchestral music is even written solely for this section. Lastly, the harp and the piano are sometimes included in the string family, just depending on the time period when the music was being played. The next largest section of the orchestra is usually the woodwind family. Most woodwind instruments use a small piece of wood called a reed to produce their vibration. The reed vibrates when air is blown across it. This is how instruments like the clarinet work. Saxophones also use a reed. This is why they are classified as a woodwind and not a brass instrument. As far as instruments go, saxophones are fairly new, having only been created in the mid-1840s. Because of this, there aren't really many orchestral pieces that include saxophone. Some woodwind instruments have a reed that has 2 parts called a double reed. Instruments like the oboe and the bassoon use a double reed. In this case, both reeds vibrate and tend to create a nasal sound. There's also one woodwind which uses just the wind part. It's the flute. The flute does not have a reed. Instead, the player just blows across a hole in the instrument, much like you would do if you were blowing across the top of a pop bottle. You might have noticed that this family has all the instruments with a ton of buttons, or keys as they're actually called, on them. One of the most challenging parts of playing a woodwind instrument is just knowing which keys to press down and getting your fingers to the right spots without getting tangled. Once mastered, a woodwind player can play quickly with ease, as you can hear in Bach's Partita for flute. In the orchestra, the higher-pitched woodwinds like flute and oboe tend to play the melody, while lower-pitched woodwinds like bassoon tend to play supporting harmonic parts. It's on to the brass family. The brass family gets its name from the shiny material that its instruments are made from. All brass instruments use the player's lip vibration and air to make sound. The player's lips vibrate rapidly against a metal mouthpiece, and the buzzing sound produced bounces and echoes its way through the instrument to make a tone you're probably familiar with. Unlike the woodwind instruments, Brass instruments have few keys. In fact, the trombone doesn't have any keys. It just uses a slide. Of course, the brass player does have more than just 3 notes available to them through pressing the keys. Brass players also change notes through changing the shape of their lips, where tenser lips play higher pitches and looser lips play lower pitches. If you've heard taps, you've heard a brass player just using their lips to change notes. The 5 main brass instruments in the orchestra are the trumpet, the horn, the trombone, the euphonium, and the tuba. In the orchestra, trumpets and horns occasionally play the melody, but much of the brass section's job is to play supporting notes. All the way in the back of the orchestra, we have the percussion family, known for its loud banging and crashing. The percussion family has instruments that are struck or shaken to make their vibrations. Early orchestras didn't have much percussion and usually just had low-pitched drums called timpani or kettle drums to accompany the melody. Other drums like the snare drum and the bass drum were added later. And apparently, composers really like percussion instruments because they haven't stopped adding to the long list of available sounds. Aside from drums, the percussion family includes cymbals, auxiliary percussion like the tambourine, triangle, shakers, or maracas, and mallet instruments like bells, xylophone, and marimba. Most of the time, percussion instruments play a supporting role, though bells and xylophone occasionally get the melody. You now know that the 4 families of the orchestra are the string, woodwind, brass, and percussion families. The string family uses string vibration, the woodwind family uses reed and air vibration, the brass family uses lip vibration, and the percussion family contains instruments that are struck or shaken to make vibration.
Okay, so there you have it. It's the basic instruments of the orchestra. And as the narrator said, the higher instruments tend to be the ones that are given the melody most often, but certainly the low instruments can be given the melody as well. It's just that the higher instruments carry better. And as, for instance, if you can imagine a violin as opposed to a cello or a bass, the distances are much smaller and they can get around the instrument much faster, so they can play many more notes in a shorter period of time. So it just depends on how any given composer wants to create the sound of their orchestra. It's called orchestration or instrumentation. But generally, the higher the instruments are the ones that are given the melody most often, and the other instruments are accompanying roles and provided color. Okay, so that is the basic idea of the orchestra. And we've talked a little bit about what you might expect if you go to a recital and hear any one of different chamber ensembles or soloists. And then let me talk to you a little bit about a program itself. So when you go into the concert, you're going to be handed a program. In this case, I just made this one up, but it has some important pieces of information that you'll need to know about. And at least maybe I'll be able to help you avoid some confusion when you're looking at things that you have no idea what they mean. So each piece, in this case, an overture, that's an opening piece, to Fingal's Cave, that's the name of the piece in this case. It's by a composer named Felix Mendelssohn. He was a 19th century Romantic composer. These are his dates. And after many pieces, it will give you a series of numbers. In this case, it's an OP or an opus in Italian. In Latin, that means work. So it's work number 26 in Mendelssohn's large output. And if you know how many pieces he wrote, which were in the hundreds and hundreds, you realize that this is a relatively early work. Not all composers use opus numbers, but most of them do. Most of the composers you will see. Unless it's a living composer, in which case frequently they have not yet assigned opus numbers. Generally, this is something that's done after a composer is dead, and they can look at the whole output and make catalog of that. In the case of the next piece on the program, Mozart, and these are his dates. See, he lived a relatively short life, did a lot in that time. We have a work called a concerto, not concerto, but a concerto for piano and orchestra. A concerto, as we will learn more about, is a work for a soloist and the orchestra, or maybe more than one soloist, but generally it's one soloist and an orchestra as an accompaniment. And the K number in this case is 477. That's a made-up number, but Mozart had into the 500s. And the K stands for Kerschel. That is the man who cataloged Mozart's works. So for Mozart and only Mozart, you see K numbers. For most composers, you will see an opus number, and then a couple of other systems for other composers that you don't really need to know about. But just trying to help you unscramble this a little bit. Then, the concerto, in this case, has 3 separate movements. So these all belong to the same piece, but each are individual movements comprising a whole. Allegro, which means fast, andante, which means moderate, and allegro assai, which means also somewhat fast. These are ways that composers had to let the performers and audiences, but performers mostly, know relatively what the general pace of the composition should be. So typically you will have in a concerto a 3-movement piece, fast, slow, fast. And they can be faster movements and they could be slower movements, but this is just kind of a general template that you will see often, something along those lines. But again, there would be the fast movement, and then there would be a pause, and then the slow movement would start, and then it would finish 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and then the last movement would begin. And then the applause. So you will not applaud in between the various movements. Okay, but you will know them, one starting and one stopping, because there will be a break between them, and then the speed or the tempo of each one will be different. And there's your intermission. You're going to go out, turn your phone on, check it, turn it back off when you come back in the hall, and sit down for the second half. In this case, the orchestra is going to play a piece called The Rite of Spring, which is a ballet by Igor Stravinsky, who was a modern 20th century composer. And this is music that was written for a ballet, but which Stravinsky then took the music only and set it for an orchestra. So it's not meant to be danced to in this case, but just listened to, and it's in 2 parts. So these are, in a certain sense, separate movements, but they don't have necessarily just all fast or all slow like you have in the Mozart concerto. But it moves in and out in different tempos. And we will talk about this piece later in the semester towards the end. But I wanted to put it here so you have an idea that it's not always in groupings like this. And as you can see in the overture at the beginning, there is no breakdown in terms of other short movements in it. It's a single piece. This is also one single piece, but it's in 2 large parts. So that's a little bit about the concert experience, which you're going to have, and you're going to save the program and staple it to your concert attendance, and hopefully it will be an enjoyable experience for you. All right. Thank you very much.